the flat HTML files. Because they're flat, they're portable. I can't easily migrate WordPress from one server to another without doing a database migration.
Yeah.
I can migrate my Jamstack websites because I can just copy paste those HTML files. And if they're calling a database somewhere, it's usually a third-party service that doesn't move. And so I just make those API calls.
This is What the Jam, an interview series where we're finding out what's next for Jamstack. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org. All right, today we have Chris Ferdinandi here, and he's a big advocate for building for the web in a simpler and more resilient way. So really excited to have Chris on today. Welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Mike. I'm glad to be here.
I want to start off with the big question. What does Jamstack mean to you?
Oh, yeah. So Jamstack to me means JavaScript APIs and markup. I first learned of Jamstack back when it was spelled properly with the uppercase letters. And having it acromanized like that, I think really helped me kind of wrap my head around what it was. It's one of those things, like the definition's always been fuzzy. Like I think anytime I would describe it to folks, there was always like a whole like, well, a React app uses JavaScript APIs and markup. Is that Jamstack?
Yeah.
And it always felt like one of those things, like maybe in definition, but not in spirit to me. So when I think about the spirit of Jamstack, I think about mostly static pre-rendered HTML with islands of JavaScript for the stuff that can't be. In a way, the way we talk about islands architecture today is probably a good way to think about, or the way I think about Jamstack in my head.
So how would you describe, for someone who doesn't know what islands architecture is, how would you describe it?
Yeah, so islands architecture, and I'm probably going to misdescribe this a little bit, so apologies. But islands architecture is when you have mostly HTML that is not rendered with JavaScript. So it could be server side, could be pre-rendered like static HTML. But then you have islands of interactivity that are either updated or rendered in their entirety with JavaScript after the fact. So just as an example, maybe you have some sort of app where the heading and navigation and footer, those all come kind of pre-rendered as they are from the server. And then maybe you have some interactive stuff in the middle, like in my own kind of development world, I create courses for folks. And so for a long time, my student portal where people access their courses was built like this, where the header and footer were static. And then the stuff in the middle was an API call to a backend that got back a list of the courses they had, and it would render that with JavaScript. So that's islands architecture.
Nice.
And it could be more than that. It could be interactive, like people click and things update. But the idea is you've got these little islands of interactivity in an otherwise static UI.
Yeah, it's kind of trying to bridge the best of both worlds. So
Yeah,
how did you get into this idea of building more resilient web apps? What does that journey look like for you?
Oh, yeah. So it started because I was really into web performance. I had read some article by Dave Rupert easily a decade ago now, probably longer than that, about improving the performance of his WordPress site by dropping jQuery for Vanilla.js, which started me on this whole Vanilla.js kick. And that was kind of like the beginning of the journey for me. And at the same time, I was also reading stuff by Tim Kadlick and a couple of other folks around web performance and why it's so important. And especially, this was like during the early days of responsive web design when mobile devices were not like nearly as good as like fiber optic connections. They were really slow. And so performance was even more important than it is today. Although it's still, not everybody has like super fast internet connections, but it was like acutely, like everybody experienced that pain. And so I got really into performance. And then I saw Jeremy Keith speak at Artifact Conference in Providence, Rhode Island, about a decade ago now, on building more resilient web experiences. And I think he used the term resilience a few times. He specifically talked about this concept of fault tolerance and building things that continue to work even when parts of them break. And this was during kind of my like just starting to get into web development thing. So it was like a really just a really kind of formative time for me. It just really stuck. And I am also someone who's come to believe that building simpler, faster, more resilient web experiences is not just like good business. It's also, in my opinion, a human rights issue. Because a lot of times the people who can't afford slow, buggy kind of things are often the people who are most vulnerable from other kind of systemic issues and things like that. Just as an example to, kind of make this a little bit more tangible. So my friend Eric, a couple of years ago, Eric Bailey, wrote an article about how he was trying to access some mental health website, and he kept encountering, I think it was like the white screen of death, right? Where you go to do something and you get nothing back. And he pointed out that this was a website that provides critical mental health services for people who are often accessing this site in times of mental distress. Like they might be in a crisis. They could be suicidal. We always joke like, oh, no one's going to die if I mess up the website. I'm not a doctor. But like sometimes that's not true. Like someone literally could experience severe harm because the thing you've built doesn't work the way it should. And in the situation with like the site he was using, it was one of those things like it was a React app where some API call failed. And so the whole thing came crashing down because JavaScript is so brittle. And so for me, as someone who, gets really fired up about human rights issues, building simpler and more resilient web experiences is a kind of a key part of that.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And what do you think the key components are? Like how do you build more resilient apps?
Yeah. So I think, and I know this is still in 2024, sometimes a loaded term, but progressive enhancement is an important part of that. So making sure that when we build things, there is some baseline experience that functions as much as possible with HTML and server calls, even when other stuff fails. So I am a really big fan of having forms that like do a full page refresh to a back end and send back some sort of data or do some sort of thing. And then when JavaScript loads, it takes over and does that in a more Ajaxy way.
Yeah.
I think a majority of what we do on the web is essentially just forms and page reloads, but handled in increasingly more complex ways. And obviously, like there's certain things where this just doesn't work. Like if you're doing like an image editing program, like you need JavaScript for that. I totally get that, right? Like there's certain things that just don't, there's a baseline that needs more interactivity. But a lot of what we do can be handled either by providing some kind of server-based baseline that gets enhanced, or alternatively that provides some sort of fallback as its baseline. So an example I sometimes use, and this is a bad example, but I'm going to use it anyways, is like, let's say you had some list of your most popular GitHub repositories on your site. And for whatever reason, like maybe you're using a static site generator that can't make API calls and you wanted to tie into GitHub's content API for this. You could, by default, have a link to your GitHub profile as the content that gets displayed. And then when the JavaScript shows up, it makes a fetch request to GitHub, gets back that list of top repositories, and then you render them into the UI. So even if that JavaScript fails, people still get something that accomplishes the ultimate goal, which is seeing your GitHub repository.
Yeah.
Kind of a bad example because I probably wouldn't use JavaScript for that at all today. There are other ways I would probably handle that, but I feel like it at least does a good job of illustrating the kind of thing I'm talking about.
Yeah, I feel like the opposite of true is where a whole lot of dependencies are introduced, which are completely not necessary at all. And to your point, like will cause a problem and break the site. And it's like if you just strip all those away and just serve HTML, which is the thing, if it's essentially a static website anyway, you just avoid a lot of those problems and are naturally going to make it more resilient.
It's true. And on the thing with tooling and dependencies and stuff too is like a lot of these tools solve complicated problems and can make certain aspects of web development easier. Like, I'm not going to deny that state-based UI as an approach, like the React way of doing web development, can make certain tasks where you have lots of interconnected UI driven by some sort of data object that gets updated by user interactions or something else. It can make doing that a lot easier. I've done those kinds of interfaces with manual DOM manipulation, and state-based UI is often way easier. But but these tools also introduce a whole bunch of other problems. So like a lot of them will do asynchronous UI rendering. They'll batch a bunch of stuff together, which means if you need to shift focus to something after you make some updates, it's a lot harder to do that than if you were to just do it with traditional JavaScript, because now you don't know when the next render is going to happen. So now you have to bake in some sort of callback function or event listener or some other hook you have to listen to do that. And a lot of those just kind of run every time. So you need to add some conditional checks, like, should I do this thing or not? And then there's the maintenance of it all, right? Where anybody who's ever gone back to a Node project after 6 months or a year and gone to run a build and hit like the wall of like errors and outdated dependencies, like it's just, it's one of these things where I think we get, diluted is maybe too strong of a word, but as an industry, we get kind of roped into this idea that these tools universally make our lives easier. And they don't. They make some tasks easier, and they introduce a bunch of complications and challenges of their own that we then need to work around. And so a big part of what I advocate for is just being more selective about which tools we use, when we use them, and why we're choosing them over other approaches.
Yeah.
Which is more controversial than it should be.
Yeah. And it's either controversial or just not considered at all. It's like, this is the tool set I use. And it's how I solve problems. Yeah.
I got yelled at once when I went on a podcast by someone who was like really upset at the idea that like React might not always be the best choice for everything. And he's like, it makes me more productive and I don't care. And it's like, all right, good for you. But like, you're also sending a ton of JavaScript down the wire to render like a hello world. It just doesn't, for certain things, it doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
It's you're building QuickBooks, sure, but it's not always what we're doing.
It's like, I can't think of the name. What are those? It's like a transport device for kids, the hoverboard.
Oh, the hoverboards.
Yeah, like the hoverboard.
Which I've never successfully balanced on once.
Neither. A hoverboard versus like a skateboard. Like a skateboard, it's got 4 wheels and 4 like maybe 6 bolts in it. So if something goes wrong, it's very easy to replace the parts on it.
Yep.
Versus a hoverboard, that thing's going in the trash if something breaks on it. Like if you need to pull it apart and figure out what's going on with the battery or something. Yep. And they're both kind of achieving the same task.
I like to I sometimes like to use the analogy of like a bike versus a car, right? Where a car will absolutely get you certain places faster. But that argument kind of falls apart once you get into a city or you're doing like, certain tasks. Oftentimes a bike get you places where a car can't, can get you there faster. It's easier to maintain. It like I have a bike that I literally haven't done anything to in 20 years and I still ride it like all the time. I stopped greasing the chain like a decade ago and it still works. But, if I needed to travel to another city, I'm probably not going to take my bike because, what would be like a 20-minute car ride would be an hour and a half on a bike. But, it's one of these things. It's just like picking the right tool for the job.
That's it. Yeah. In San Francisco, a car's probably the slowest form of transport. I think
you were much better off on a bike, a skateboard, an e-scooter, like just anything,
So what do you think the core like tenets of the Jamstack are?
Yeah. So for me, I think the thing that, the old, is a React website Jamstack or not? I think for me, the thing that really kind of where I feel comfortable saying, no, it's not, even though it kind of under the old JAM acronym technically was. I think the big kind of precondition there is having pre-rendered HTML, not just like an empty div or like a blank HTML file, but some sort of actual functional content. The JavaScript piece and the APIs are actually optional. They're like for the stuff that you can't do. And so for me, I always think about Jamstack as mostly static websites that then bolt in additional interactivity through some other means. And the kind of the heart of that is the pre-rendered HTML. Either, if you're a masochist, I guess, you could hand code your HTML files. You only get a couple of them. I have definitely done that. Or some sort of like static site generator. I think that's kind of the crux of it. One of the things I heard a few years ago during some of this conversation before the whole is Jamstack dead conversation was kind of this idea that maybe Jamstack is just branding, right? There was this kind of whole like, how is static HTML different from, or pre-rendered HTML different from server rendered HTML with some good caching layered on top of it, which that always struck me as a fair argument, right? Like, is WordPress with a PHP caching layer on top, is that Jamstack? My gut tells me no, and I think part of what also makes Jamstack is the flat HTML files. Because they're flat, they're portable. I can't easily migrate WordPress from one server to another without doing a database migration.
Yeah.
I can migrate my Jamstack websites because I can just copy paste those HTML files. And if they're calling a database somewhere, it's usually a third-party service that doesn't move. And so I just make those API calls. So I don't know if I directly answered your question, because there's a lot of like, it gets really fuzzy. It's always been kind of a fuzzy term. I think there's been so much kind of debate around it over the years.
Yeah, that one is an interesting one. I feel like it often comes up, the cache in a dynamic site. Like, I've been thinking, I'm hearing it in this conversation. I've heard it in a lot of the conversations we've been having. It's this idea of like start with static. Static's the default. And I really like that as a paradigm, because it's like, just try and make things more static is like generally going to be a good thing. So like, if you have a WordPress site, add a cache on it. That's a step to making it more static, and it'll make it more resilient.
Yep.
To make then the next step there, which may or may not make sense, is like underneath the cache, maybe get rid of the database.
Right.
So it's just rendering from files, but still PHP. And then another step is like, make it purely static. And each step towards static, you're going to get it more resilient, maybe more performance. But then each step the other way, you're going to have more flexibility and dynamicness. So it's like, it's not saying one is better than the other. It's just like, consider the trade-offs in each direction. And if you don't need the dynamicness, like, try and go as fast static as possible.
I did a terrible thing recently, Mike.
Yeah.
I used, so Hugo is my static site generator of choice, just because I started using it before, like, Zach was literally just starting to build 11T, and it did not have like its training wheels off yet. So I was like, all right, Hugo's here. I'm just going to start here and I'll switch later. But that course portal I have for my students. So it used to be, the HTML frame and then JavaScript to render the courses. But it was always a little like, I was unhappy with the delay between showing that frame and then loading the courses in. I'd done a lot of stuff to speed it up. I'd added some service workers, and I was caching API calls and all this. And it was one of those things where I was like, man, this is one thing where like server rendering actually is better for this than what I'm doing now. But I don't want to go back to WordPress. Yeah. So Hugo has this concept of custom output formats. So like, out of the box, you can, instead of just rendering HTML, you could say like, render this as an RSS feed, or render this as a JSON file. And I was like, what if I rendered, instead of index.html files, what if I rendered index.php files that conditionally, so I have this ridiculous system where I have all of my content is authored in Markdown, just like I love, and it's all flat files. And then the when it compiles, it spits out index.php files, one for each route. So I'm not having to do like PHP based routing in an htaccess file. So it's working off of the way servers and browsers work. And when the page opens, it's still mostly that HTML frame, but the dynamic bits are now being rendered with PHP. So it does like a little check. I'm actually using flat JSON files for all of my storage instead of a database. But so it's like, does this person have access to this thing? Yes, here, show them the content. If not, redirect them. And it is so much faster and so much more resilient than what I was doing before. But then the big question that came up from one of my students was like, hey, so is this still Jamstack? Because you're not really serving like just HTML. I technically am, but I'm also kind of doing some PHP stuff. And so like there's always server activity with every view now. So I don't know. This is one of those things where it feels like yes in spirit, but not in actuality. So kind of the opposite of the React app. And this is where I think the term Jamstack runs into a lot of issues because it's so fuzzy and it starts to fall apart in some very like clear places, right?
Yeah.
So it has all the portability that I love. Like I can take the entire file system, drop it on a different host tomorrow and make no other updates and it'll work. I don't have to change anything. It's just FTP up, FTP down, or like in my case, I have some like GitHub workflow, but same idea. So I don't know. Yeah, it's very fuzzy.
It's a great use case to test because I feel like Jamstack, at least in the initial definition, it was so prescriptive that like making that jump, you almost feel guilty about because you're like, oh, it's not Jamstack anymore. Is that okay? And it's like, that shouldn't be it should be like, is the trade-off worth it? Should be the question. And in yours case, you get more performance. You probably get, it's hard to see how you would have less resiliency. Like you actually have it's going to hit something dynamic anyway to get the courses. So like, it doesn't. And
I'm still caching the HTML files. I'm just not, I don't have to deal with caching so I still have like the service worker with the offline mode if stuff goes down. But I've cut out that middle step of that API call. So it's a bigger win, but it's not pure Jamstack anymore. And I think that's okay. I just, I'm starting to, as we're having this conversation, I remember being really upset when they dropped the JAM stack for Jamstack, like, all lowercase. And I'm now maybe a little bit starting to understand where kind of the prescriptive nature of it gets problematic, right? But then that gets us back to, so what actually is Jamstack? Like, is that Jamstack? Is it not? I don't know.
Well, I mean, I feel like the term has become so broad now that I don't see what isn't Jamstack, honestly, anymore. Like under the modern definition, I think WordPress is Jamstack, which is like the antithesis of Jamstack.
To say more about that, so tell me more. Why do you think that? I'm curious.
Let me break it up. Let's see what.
Okay.
So let me see. So think of WordPress as I'm reading this. Jamstack is an architectural approach that decouples the web experience layer from the data and business logic, improving flexibility, scalability, performance, and maintainability. WordPress doesn't fit in there. It doesn't decouple. Jamstack removes the need for business logic to dictate the web experience. Doesn't fit that. It enables a composable architecture for the web where custom logic and third-party services are consumed through APIs. Yeah, maybe it doesn't fit that either. But this
is the new Netlify changing the definition to fit their new business model definition.
A bit of that, yeah. Like the reason it makes me think of WordPress is WordPress is it is like very flexible in what it can do. You can pull in all sorts of plugins to do all sorts of things. I don't think I think it goes against like everything I believe the Jamstack should be. But like
Yeah.
the point is, like, I feel like the term's so wide now that it's hard to say like this is and this isn't Jamstack. But
So think about the definition you just read though, and compare that to, I just pulled up the 2019, I'm sorry, 2018 version of jamstack.org.
yeah, shoot.
Modern web development architecture based on client-side JavaScript, reusable APIs, and pre-built markup.
Yeah, that's it.
That's the definition that was like, oh, I like this,
Yeah.
right? The pre-built markup in particular, I think for me is the real, like, the game changer piece of the Jamstack. The other stuff is great, like client-side JS, the reusable APIs, in particular, kind of that decoupling where you like I used to, my WordPress site, oh God, I had a couple like really bad hacks on that. It used to like crash if you got too many visitors, like just that whole thing, like moving away from that. Great. Yeah, this new definition is really fuzzy. Like I could read it 3 times and still not know what the heck it means.
Yeah, I kind of like, I get the idea behind it. Like a lot of these principles are being applied to more and more applications, and like it's less about websites now. Yeah. I think if you tweak it a little bit, where it's about the pursuit of getting to static, and if, like I was describing before, if you have a purely dynamic site, one step to getting more static is adding a cache, and then like what's the step after that? If it's more about that, then I feel like it actually fits, and you can have quite a wide spectrum. It's just like the conversation is always about these different trade-offs you're making at each step. But just having this wide umbrella and just saying all of this is Jamstack, then it's like, well, that's just web development, really. It doesn't become a very useful term at that point. Right.
Yeah. This is one of these things. This conversation has been me refining, because I'll be honest, I haven't had like a really good definition of Jamstack in my head for a while.
Yeah.
Because it's gotten so fuzzy. So the conversation is like me kind of refining my thinking around this out loud.
Oh, me too.
But I think for me, the pre-built nature of it is kind of the big thing. The fact that I could copy paste some actual files and drop them anywhere is what makes Jamstack versus some other things.
Yeah.
And if you can't do that, like the whole, well, what about WordPress with a cache layer? That doesn't necessarily make that any less valid. I just don't personally think that's Jamstack.
Yeah.
I think that's absolutely an appropriate business choice for a variety of reasons, but I also don't think that's a Jamstack website. And I'm not like one of those like Jamstack or die kind of people. You know what I mean? Like it's not.
Yeah. And it's interesting because it gets like, let's talk about go back to your use case.
Yeah.
Is that like, with that thinking, is that Jamstack?
It's one of those things, right? It's like, it's technically, but also it's not, because the files are pre-rendered. And there's API calls happening. They're not happening with JavaScript. Yeah. They're happening on the server. But most of the HTML in that file is pre-rendered. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know if like WordPress is a dynamic site in the sense that the HTML that you're getting just doesn't exist at all. Like there's a database call and a bunch of template files all coming together. Whereas with what I've built, you're just literally loading an index PHP file that like echoes out some content at you. And I guess that's technically not, it's still server rendered. It's not pre-built, but it's almost pre-built. So I don't know. I guess like technically no, technically it's not. I don't know.
I feel like if it's not, I'm not saying it's not, but if it's not,
you can say it's not, it's okay.
I feel like it should be like, we shouldn't be dogmatic about it. Like, it's not good because it's not Jamstack. It's like, okay, what are the trade-offs? Okay, you're going to have a big spinner while the courses load if you do it with Jamstack. And it's probably going to be a slower user experience. So, and the dynamic one, you've you've reduced a lot of the dependencies and made it pretty portable. Like any server that supports PHP it will work on. So like, is that trade-off worth it? And there's a pretty good case for yes, that is worth it.
The other thing that I'm not sure of, right? So where there's no database, so it's not like, I don't know where kind of that line between, I don't know. I could talk in circles about this. So I think part of the thing for me is I agree about not getting dogmatic about it. I also think that it's potentially important to have a slightly more rigid definition of things so that we can describe what they are and how they work, right?
Yeah, agreed.
So like, we were talking about carpentry before the show, right? So like, there are, when you think about like making joints for a cabinet, right? You could use a butt joint or a dovetail joint. They're both joints. You're still making a drawer for a cabinet, but you can't call a butt joint dovetail and be like, well, it doesn't really matter. It's still you know what I mean? Like, having that distinction is useful when talking about the trade-offs. You know, one's more complicated, but it's stronger. You know, in this case, it doesn't really matter. You know, so there's benefits to having those definitions to talk about the trade-offs. I think there's a second umbrella here of whether you call it the lean web or something else, of building more like performant, resilient things. And Jamstack is one approach to getting there. It's not the only approach. It's not always the best approach, but it's one approach.
I think that's really important.
So I think part of the problem, at least I'm thinking about what I've done now, I've tried to use Jamstack in many instances as a catch-all for that idea of the lean web. And it's not. It's a technique you can use to get there, but it's not the only way. So that's as much on me as anybody. I feel like I just had an epiphany from talking with you, Mike.
Yeah. No, I think you nailed it. Like it really doesn't need to be the silver bullet for every use case. Like I think it needs to be very strong about what it's good at and what it's not good at. And it like for a beginner coming into web development, it's so intimidating with so many frameworks and everything. I feel like Jamstack could be a nice entry point. Like start with this stack. It's a good like default. And then if you need to go outside that, just understand those trade-offs that you're making.
Yeah. Like I can remember in the early 2000s, like I learned web development by building like an about me page, you know, just literally hand coding the HTML. And I think it was like almost entirely like inline CSS back then, right? Like just like center this text and let me throw in this construction graphic GIF, right? But like you can I feel like that's a really good, we've gotten away from that as a starting point. Like for a lot of folks, learning web development means jumping into JavaScript first. Yes. And I think that's to a lot of folks' detriment.
Yeah, it's a dangerous place to start.
It is. Yeah, you can break a lot of stuff. I had a thought somewhere and then it like completely floated out of my brain. So
sorry.
No, it's not because of you. It's my flighty brain right now.
So let's talk about the term. So for the future of Jamstack, do you think keeping the term Jamstack is good? Do you think or a new term is the way to go?
Well, I'm of two minds. So if the term remains, I think going back to the acromanized uppercase JAM version might actually be a worthwhile thing, because for me, it was the kind of the pre-built markup was and is the kind of the heart of it. I think I look at things like Islands architecture, and Islands architecture in many ways is Jamstack, or can be, where you've got lots of kind of comes from the server HTML with some pockets of interactivity powered by JavaScript. But it could be server rendered or it could be pre-built. And I think if we got a little bit more narrow on our definition of Jamstack, it becomes useful again. Like right now in its current, the way Netlify defined it with, decoupled web experience thing, like that's not super, super useful because they've conflated microservices versus monolith, server versus like they've just conflated a lot of different things into one big bucket. And that's not particularly useful for making decisions. Whereas pre-built versus server, I see that as Jamstack. And then within Jamstack, or then you've got kind of this other layer of islands architecture, which you could use with Jamstack, you could use with server rendered. If you're going Jamstack, you're probably using microservices, but you might not need them. You might just have some static websites that don't need any sort of backend at all. I do Jamstack as a monolith. So I have Jamstack sites that use Hugo to make API calls and like hard code stuff into the markup at build time. And none of those services for me are microservices. Almost every single one of them is some like backend I host on the same server where the HTML eventually lives. In fact, where the HTML gets built, because I have like a continuous integration process. But I think that's still Jamstack. The microservices aspect like shouldn't be in there. So long-winded way of saying I think Jamstack is still useful. I'd personally like to see it spelled JAM, like all uppercase again, and have that definition get refocused on the pre-built markup and then the APIs powered by JavaScript. Or not. Nowadays, like static site generators can do a lot of API stuff for you. So if you have a non-dynamic API-based content, I know 11t can do the same thing, can make API calls and render stuff. Actually, 11t, just quick plug for what Zach's built, 11t can do that better than Hugo because unlike Hugo, 11t can also generate individual pages from API results, which is amazing. You can just do like so many cool things with that. So here's, I'm talking in circles, but 11t is interesting because it uses JavaScript under the hood. So technically it is still JavaScript driven API calls. Where it's like, anyway, that's an implementation detail. But yeah, so yes, keep the definition, narrow it down to something a little bit more specific. Personally, I think that's where it starts to become useful again. Not as like everybody should build like this, but as here is a description of a specific implementation approach and the pros and cons of using it, because there are trade-offs,
Exactly. Yeah. I think that's kind of necessary so people can consider those trade-offs. So if the definition becomes essentially static websites or pre-built websites, why not call it like pre-rendering or pre-building, or like, why call it Jamstack?
I actually think that's valid. I don't necessarily disagree with that, to be honest with you. I'm not particularly precious about the term. One thing I have found just generally with web developer folks is when you give something a cute acronym, it sticks better than when you just describe what it does. Like islands architecture is not new. Some of the tools we use to implement it maybe are, but it's the same stuff we were doing with jQuery like a decade or two ago. They called it islands architecture and everybody's like, oh, this is super new. Another good example, right, is like HTML over the wire that Basecamp or 37 Signals or whoever came up with a while ago. Like that is not new. Everybody's like, they've reinvented API calls and client-side apps. Like they didn't. They just gave it a name, right? Like, so same thing with Jamstack, right? I think calling it pre-rendered HTML, great, cool. I actually don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think having some sort of kind of cute name to go with it can potentially help with marketing, or not. And Jamstack is a very loaded term at this point. So who's to say?
Yeah, that's the blessing and the curse, right? Like everyone knows-ish what it means, but it also has a lot of baggage and it's moved a lot. So then there's another whole re-education piece, which probably not everyone will be on board with, and some people will stick with another definition, and it's just messy. but it's well known and it's used. Maybe not so much these days.
Yeah, I feel like you come up with another term, it's not guaranteed that it'll actually stick or
Yeah.
catch on. You know what I mean? I've never really figured out a formula for what sort of buzzwords spread like wildfire and which ones don't. So
Yeah. So, how do you think Jamstack remains relevant in web development? You've kind of answered this, but moving forward.
yeah. So I think a big part of what made it relevant was kind of the thing we talked about earlier around being more I forget the prescriptive, I think is the word you used, right? Where it described a very specific technique or approach. I think when it gets watered, when any term gets watered down because of marketing reasons, it loses a lot of its teeth, a lot of what makes it interesting in the first place. And if we want the term or the approach to stick around, giving it a more narrow definition that accurately describes what it does is important. Yeah, I think I remember seeing something, I forget who wrote it a while back, about how like we don't even really need the term anymore because everything is a Jamstack site nowadays. And it's like, no, it's not. That's not accurate at all. WordPress is still like what, 50-60% of the internet. Like, it's just not in line with reality. So having like a nice narrow definition, I think, is a really big part of maintaining relevance as a technique.
Yeah, agreed. Let's end it on that note. Chris, thank you so much for joining today. This is a great chat.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was really, really great catching up with you. If anybody wants to tell me how wrong I was, you can find all my contact info over at gomakethings.com. I'd love to argue about how to build websites with people. So come on over.
Love it. That's it for today's interview. Find out more at thefutureofjamstack.org.